Good morning. I hope you can all hear me. I'm going to make a start. I know there are still people coming in, but we've got a lot to get through. So if you don't mind, we'll get underway. A very warm welcome to all of you to our panel on lawfare, what it is and how to counter it. I'm joined by an extraordinary group of people this morning who will be known to many of you, but I will take a few moments to introduce them if I may. On my far right, we have Maria Caruana Galizia. He's the son of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the Maltese journalist assassinated in October 2017. Daphne was killed in order to silence her, but her death was the culmination of years of harassment, a central theme of which harassment was the use of multiple lawsuits and legal threats against her by those whose corruption she was exposing. And Matthew even inherited some of this litigation when Daphne was killed. Matthew, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist in his own right, now runs the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation, and a key strand of the foundation's work and mission is access to justice, which is a critical issue in the fight against lawfare, as we will come to hear. Also joining us will be Maria Ressa, and she will be joining us remotely from Manila. She needs little introduction. She's the co-founder, CEO, and president of Rappler, the digital news platform. She is a victim of lawfare in her own right. She knows firsthand how debilitating it is to practice journalism in the face of legal onslaught. She has researched and written extensively on the subject and was, of course, recognized for her courage and integrity by the Nobel Committee in 2021. She's had to post bail 10 times just to keep working. We'll also hear from my colleague and friend Caoilfhionn Gallagher KC, formerly QC. She is the leading UK-based lawyer in the field of journalists' safety and media freedom. Her clients include Maria, Matthew, and other similarly affected individuals, including Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong journalist and media entrepreneur currently in prison and facing a variety of spurious lawsuits himself. It is an honor that Jimmy's son Sebastian and his daughter-in-law Rhoda, who herself is an incredibly talented writer, are here in the audience this morning with us. Caoilfhionn and I may have started our careers in media law expecting to practice defamation, privacy, and similar fields, but we've had to adapt. We've had to become used to keeping pace with the exotic causes of action now being used by authoritarian regimes to silence their critics. And finally, we're going to hear from Jodie Ginsberg, who sits on my right. Jodie's the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists, an independent non-profit organization that promotes press freedom. I'm hoping that Jodie is going to, after we've all been thoroughly depressed by the state of the world and the use of these tactics, Jodie's going to provide some hope, some optimism by explaining how journalists can be supported. And can I also invite you to join Jodie and others from the Thomson Reuters Foundation later this afternoon, because at 5 o'clock they are launching a report on, they're launching Columbia University's Press Freedom Legal Trends Report, which is a report identifying key legal threats to independent journalism worldwide. So what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Matthew, and then we'll hear from each of the panel, and then I'm going to open the floor to a discussion. Matthew.
Hi everyone, and thank you Jonathan for that introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. To talk about something which is quite important to me because of the experience that my mother went through and that my family went through after her murder. It starts a very long time ago. I guess in the early 90s, Malta was, and still is a bit, of a very conservative place. Imagine like Sicily 100 years ago, where women were expected to just be quiet, stay in the kitchen, at home, cooking, taking care of the children, and so on. But my mother didn't fit into this mold. She wanted to break it. She loved reading, she loved writing, so for her, a natural pathway was journalism. She wanted to write about the things that she thought were wrong with Maltese society, and she saw this as a way of breaking free and expressing herself. She explained it by saying that some painters feel compelled to paint, musicians feel compelled to make music, and she felt compelled to write, to do journalism, to publish her opinion. But because she didn't fit into the mold of what a woman in Maltese society should be like, the people she was writing about fought back against her. They sent her threatening letters, they disparaged her publicly in political speeches, in opinion columns in the newspaper. But one of the key ways that they tried to harass my mother, Malta's business elite, right? So powerful people in business, in government, whatever political party was in government. The way they harassed her was through defamation proceedings. So by filing libel suits against her, demanding compensation for what they said was the fact that she had damaged their reputation. These cases started off as a trickle. So, I mean, while sort of my friends' mothers were, you know, at home preparing dinner or making breakfast for their children, because that's how Malta was, my mother was in and out of court defending herself in these defamation proceedings. It's one of the key memories that I grew up with, my mother having to deal with all these court cases. And as I grew older, the number of cases increased, but it became really bad in the year or 2 years leading up to her assassination. Many of you will probably remember the Panama Papers. They were published in 2016. That leak exposed really extensive corruption in the Maltese government. My mother was the first journalist in Malta to begin reporting about this corruption, so she suffered the brunt of the backlash. There were many defamation proceedings that were filed against her, and one of the things that she wondered about at the time was why so many of the same group of people were all using the same tactic. It was only when it was too late after the murder that we realized why. But before I go into that, I'll start with our experience just a few days after my mother's murder. It, of course, came as an extreme shock to my family. We knew that things were really bad in Malta with corruption. My mother was extremely worried about the situation in Malta. She had said to my brother at the time, just a few months before her murder, that she felt like she was being fried alive. But what happened after that, I mean, what I really wasn't prepared for after the murder, was that things just kept getting worse and worse. So 3 days after the murder itself, before we were even allowed to bury what was left of my mother's body, because the car bomb had destroyed almost everything, was that we were expected to be in court, my brothers, my father and I, to defend ourselves against 4 of the more than 40 defamation cases that we had inherited from my mother. So that morning, I mean, still sort of dealing with the shock of the murder, I put on my suit and tie, my brothers did the same, my father the same, and we all drove to the courthouse together to defend ourselves against a corrupt politician who was suing my mother for defamation and who had used those proceedings to freeze her bank accounts. What did this do to my family? The moment we inherited all of these cases, it meant we could no longer dedicate ourselves full-time, or could not dedicate ourselves full-time, to pursuing justice for the murder. We had another battle to fight, which was the same one that my mother was dealing with. Or rather, you could say it was 46 battles, because that was the number of lawsuits we inherited. This took away a huge amount of our energy and resources, because we had to hire lawyers, we had to collect all the evidence that would allow us to defend ourselves in these proceedings. Because in Malta's system, unless we defended ourselves, we would lose by default, which would have meant we would lose our home, our cars, all our savings. The total damages would have amounted to hundreds of thousands of euros. So what we did was rally the support of a group of people, international organizations, lawyers like Caoilfhionn and Jonathan, and they came to our aid. International organizations provided us with the funding that we needed to hire lawyers, to defend ourselves, to hire people, set up the foundation named after my mother, where we have people working full-time on corruption investigations, defending ourselves against these defamation cases, and also extending the fight to assisting other families, other journalists, which have to deal with the same kind of proceedings that my mother dealt with. I thought that my mother was alone in this fight, but really what I realized after the murder is that there are so many other journalists and activists in the European Union and beyond who are dealing with these kinds of cases. We're helping some journalists in Croatia and some others in Poland that have 50 libel cases against the publication that they work for example. Some publications that have close to 100 defamation cases against them. Some journalists that have been bankrupted by the libel cases that have been filed against them. There are activists that are fighting really important campaigns for environmental justice all over the world, against environmental crimes, that are being sued into silence by the corporations or by the officials that are behind these environmental crimes. So this fight that, for me, started with my mother in Malta has become something that is of really global significance. A few years ago, we joined up with other organizations to start what's called the Coalition Against Slaps in Europe. This is a coalition of NGOs that are involved in activism, like environmental justice, and others that are involved in press freedom, to defend each other against defamation proceedings. Previously, what would happen, and we discovered this after a lot of research, is that organizations would stop their campaigns in silence, or journalists would stop reporting on a particular subject matter in silence. Slowly, we noticed that articles were disappearing from online media, that activists were stopping campaigns without explanation. And by speaking to these activists and these journalists, we realized what was going on. They were being threatened in secret because they didn't have the resources to fight off the defamation cases. They just stopped them in silence. What we're doing is pushing back against this. And we're hoping that our campaign will lead to the enactment of legislation that will make these kinds of abusive proceedings more difficult to start. So if any of you are dealing with these kinds of proceedings, if you need assistance to fight back, or if you know anyone who does, please get in touch with us. We are really here to help fight back against this. For my family and me, it's a matter of long-term justice for my mother. We can't do anything to bring her back to life, but what we can do is make sure that there is a long-term impact from the fight that she started, and that, of course, she didn't give her life in vain. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much. Matthew, I've got a question for you, but I'm going to save it because I want to hear from Maria now. So I'm hoping that we can go live to Manila, where joining us by Zoom should be Maria Ressa, who I've introduced already. And can she be broadcast? I'm not sure. If that's not feasible, great. Hello, Maria. How lovely to see you. I sent Maria a photograph earlier of me in the auditorium, and she got very concerned about whether she needed to get dressed up, and I said, don't worry, Maria, I'm the only person in Perugia wearing a tie, and I think that's still the case. Exactly. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Maria. Thank you. Maria, we can't hear you. You may be muted, dutifully. No? So I think it's a problem on our end.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you.
All right. Well, I was just going to say, I wish I was there with you in Perugia. I just landed in Manila a few hours ago, and I actually have to work. But listening to Matthew is always heart-wrenching. And the story is replicated in so many ways in what we've lived through. Let's start with what has changed for journalists and why the law has been used against us. I mean, in my case, this is my 37th year as a journalist, and I've never lived through anything like this. It started in 2016, the year the political dominoes began to fall after information operations began attacking both geopolitical power lines and journalists, right? You don't have to censor if you can make journalists stop. And in our case, both Rappler, the company that I run, and I were attacked exponentially on social media. This is, Matthew had told me his mom had gone through similar things. Exponential, 90 hate messages per hour. That was coming bottom up. A year later, a meta-narrative that was seeded in 2016, journalist equals criminal, came from our President Duterte himself. And it was in his State of the Nation address. About a week after that, I got my first subpoena. Rappler got its first subpoena. 2018, we spent in investigations, 14 investigations. But within 4 months of being told of the government trying to shut us down in January 2018, within 4 months, we dropped almost 50% of our advertising revenue. So you're getting attacked in two ways. You're getting attacked reputation-wise, you're getting attacked business-wise, because when the government attacks you, you lose your revenue. And then, of course, with the legal challenges in 2019, I started to get the first of 10 arrest warrants that came in less than 2 years. And I just kept posting bail. We should have, the company probably would have died in 2018 in a war of attrition, which is precisely, I think, what the Duterte administration wanted, if we hadn't pivoted quickly to find an alternative, sustainable business model. So in that sense, I suppose, crisis is good. But I will tell you the cost to the company was huge. In about a year and a half, we had to spend maybe about $1 million in legal fees. This is money taken away from the company at a time when government actions were meant to shut us down. But 2020, then came the verdict. I was found guilty, and that case has gone all the way to the Supreme Court. And then it just kept continuing. But here's good news before I hand it. The good news is not only have we survived the 6 years of the Duterte administration, we've grown as a company. And of the 10 criminal charges that I face, 7 have died, and most especially the last four, just last January, 4 criminal tax evasion charges that carried a maximum of 34 years in prison. That went away like this on January 18th. 3 criminal charges left, and we continue to fight.
Maria, thank you. Can I just ask you about something you said? You talked about being attacked reputationally as well as legally, but do you see a connection between those two? Do you see a sort of nexus between the need to damage your reputation and the use by the state of these litigation tactics against you?
It's the foundation of it. They're connected, you know, and this is part of what technology has helped enable, but essentially the social media companies that now deliver information to each of us, deliver the news to us, prioritizes the spread of lies over facts. An MIT study showed in 2018 that it was lies spread at least 6 times faster than facts, right? Especially if it's laced with anger and hate. So, you know, these information operations come at you with the lies, people begin to believe it, and people can't tell the difference between fact and fiction. When, I've said this repeatedly over the last 6 or 7 years, if you don't have facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without these 3, not only can you not have journalism, you cannot have democracy. So it's been an existential moment, not just for journalism, but for all of us who care about facts, right? So tearing down a journalist's reputation, tearing down trust is the first step. And then the debilitating legal cases, as Matthew pointed out, these things take you away from actually doing the journalism. And oftentimes that's to stop you from finding that thread of corruption. This is what we spent, I mean, in the last 6 years, I probably spent 70 to 80% of my time, at one point, 90% of my time dealing with legal cases instead of actually growing Rappler, right? So hopefully, there are many ways that you have to attack this problem, because the last part, and this goes to both Keelan and Jodie, you know, you cannot have law, rule of law, without the facts, right? So even as the law is being weaponized against journalists, the ground that this kind of shared reality that we live on is threatened.
Maria, thanks very much. I'm going to have to move on now. It's unusual that a lawyer would let their client speak first, but it's now time to move from you to your lawyer, to Keelan, and I'll hand over to her now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, and what a privilege it is, but also rather daunting to speak after 2 such inspiring people, after Matthew and Maria, who I'm also privileged to represent. And I did want to start. Daphne, a number of weeks before her death, on 6th of October 2017, wrote in her blog, "In journalism, as in life, sometimes you find the backup you need a little late." And it feels to me that what we're looking at here is backup for what happened to Daphne. And we're thinking, as Matthew said in his remarks, his very powerful remarks just now, we're thinking about ways in which Daphne's death is not in vain, and we can think about ways in which we can learn lessons from the horrific events of October 2017 and learn lessons from the horrific experience that Maria has had too. And one of the things that's very inspiring about this festival, here we are in Perugia, surrounded by people like Matthew, people like Maria, who've experienced the most horrendous things themselves and are now dedicating their time and their lives to speaking out for other people and trying to protect other people. And I think there's great power in this room and this virtual room with Maria, and we need to harness it. I want to talk about 4 topics today, just briefly, before we turn to Jodie and Jodie's hope, as she's been billed as the positive one on the panel. I wanted to talk first of all about lawfare as a phenomenon, what it is and what it often signifies. Second, I want to just talk about a few of the trends that I'm seeing in my work about how lawfare is used, so some of the features. Third, I just want to flag some of the ways in which it's very difficult to defend yourself as a journalist from this kind of attack, particularly because it's often an attack on multiple fronts. And then fourth and finally, I wanted to give some very preliminary thoughts before handing over to Jodie on what we can do in order to tackle this. So really 3 points about the problem and then one moving towards a solution. So first of all, about the problem, just wanted to give you 3 concepts from war. I mean, we've used for this panel the title Lawfare, using the language of war, because that's essentially what this is. Because journalists, as you've heard from Maria, facing war, essentially, on multiple fronts, and as you've heard from Matthew. So 3 concepts from warfare that I think are relevant. The first is attrition warfare. And in military terms, that's a strategy of wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse through continuous loss of personnel and material, used to defeat enemies with low resources and high morale. Now, I think many journalists we know are people who are low on resources but high on morale. And attrition warfare is really what we're seeing here. So when Matthew spoke about the cases starting as a trickle and then becoming a flood, or when Maria spoke, as she did, about the barrage of cases that she's facing, essentially war on multiple fronts. These are all forms of attrition warfare. That's what they are. They're using the law as a form of attrition warfare, and often the law being used with other things, with online attacks, with attempts to cripple your advertisers so that you're also having a financial battle too, just to keep doing your job. Second concept is decapitation, a military concept. And that's a military concept of achieving strategic paralysis by targeting political leadership, command and control, strategic weapons, and critical economic nodes. And in many of these cases, what we see is states and other powerful actors targeting, essentially, journalism leadership. So targeting Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong and Apple Daily, not only to silence Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily, but also to send a very clear message to other journalists about in Hong Kong: keep quiet or you'll be next. Targeting Maria Ressa in the Philippines, again, both to target Maria herself, but also to send a message to other journalists who dare to do their job in the Philippines: keep quiet or you'll be next. And targeting Daphne in Malta, again with that message: keep quiet or you'll be next. I see Caroline Muscat in the audience, who's quite a good example of how that message has certainly failed for some in Malta. And again, that's back to the idea that this is a very powerful room. So I do think that strategy of decapitation is one that we see with Lawfare. So targeting media houses, media owners, prolific journalists, and states essentially targeting people who are emblematic, precisely because they can be silenced, which does a job in itself, and it can send a message to others. And then the other concept from warfare is asymmetric costs. And that's a military concept of ensuring the cost of enemy losses is at least an order of magnitude higher than the cost of attacking. And again, that's something that we see, because part of the idea with Lawfare is to just make it very difficult to do your job. And then that can lead to journalists self-censoring, journalists deciding, as many have, to simply leave their job and go into a different profession because of what they're facing. So I think with Lawfare, we see all 3 of those military concepts. And I think it's also important to remember that with Lawfare, it often signifies a culture of impunity. And we started this discussion by talking about Daphne and how Daphne's death in October 2017 was deeply shocking, but was not a surprise in the context of the many decades of targeting that she'd faced, the multiple lawsuits that Matthew's referred to, the way in which she and her family were attacked. She's attacked online, attacked in the street, attacked in her home. So in many ways, this was an aberration and an appalling incident which was predictable because of what she'd faced. And one of her descriptions, I mean, Matthew used that phrase that she used to you a number of weeks before her death, saying it feels like they're trying to fry me alive. And she did also compare herself to the play, The Crucible, and used a phrase as well where she said, you get used to it like a scar forms around a wound. And for those of you who haven't heard it, 10 days before her death, she gave an interview to the Council of Europe describing in her own words, her own very powerful words, precisely the danger she was in and how she was facing this war on multiple fronts. But it's important to say that that culture of impunity, which we've now established there was a culture of impunity in Malta at the time in 2017, thanks to the independent public inquiry, which found that the Maltese state should shoulder responsibility for her death, and found that a culture of impunity was created from the highest echelons of power within the Castile. But it's important to say that it's not just a culture of impunity within Malta itself, because during those decades and during those years and months and weeks in the lead up to what happened in October 2017, we could see what was happening in Malta, and frankly the world stood idly by. I mean, similarly, prior to Jamal Khashoggi's death, we could see what was happening with Saudi Arabia, and the world stood idly by. We can now see, writ large, what's happening with China, with Russia, with Iran, what they're doing to journalists within their own territories, and what they're doing to journalists externally around the world who dare to speak and to hold them to account. And again, the world is simply not doing enough. So it's important to say that there's a much wider culture of impunity outside the state itself. Now, the next thing I wanted to turn to just briefly is a number of trends that I see in relation to lawfare. And first of all, what I'm increasingly seeing, and I know Jonathan's seeing this in his work too, is a wide range of different laws being weaponised against journalists. So no longer are we seeing just the traditional tools that are used against journalists being weaponised. So defamation laws, for example, or national security laws, which have been used a lot over the last 3 decades in particular. We're now also seeing journalists targeted, for example, using copyright laws, using fraud laws, regulatory laws, and so on. Very wide range of laws being used against people, and often used at the same time. So we see, Matthew referred there to there being 46 cases against Daphne at the time of her death. So we often see multiple suits at the same time, sometimes all defamation suits, something that we see a lot in Europe, for example, or we see someone facing, as Jimmy Lai has, protest cases, so peaceful assembly type cases, criminal charges for those, bogus fraud charges, and also national security law type charges. Or with Maria again facing a barrage of lawsuits on multiple fronts, cyberlibel, financial, bogus tax charges, and so on. So we get a range of laws often coming at you at the same time. It's like that old fairground game of whack-a-mole, where you're having to deal with multiple things at multiple times, and often different types of things. We also see laws being used to discredit the journalists. So instead of the laws just being used to target their journalism itself, it goes after them as a person, suggests somehow they're a money launderer, they're a fraud. See Rana Ayub in India, see Mir Shakil or Rahman in Pakistan, for example. So suggesting somehow that this is a person not to be trusted. This is a con artist, this is a fraud, this is a money launderer. So we see that happening too. And much, much harder, I can tell you, to get civil society and the general public on board when you're dealing with something like that, because there's much more awareness when you're dealing with defamation law being used to target, for example, a piece of public interest reporting. Many people know that's wrong, but when you see someone being called a fraud or a money launderer, for example, it's much harder to get public sympathy for that kind of thing. A lot of people think, well, mud sticks, there's no smoke without fire, so that's particularly difficult. We also see a trend of weaponising laws which are ostensibly designed to protect journalists and journalism. For example, fake news laws, online harms laws. See in the last 24 hours the arrest of Serdar Akinan in Turkey, for example, which is a good example of this. So on charges of disseminating fake news, for example, something which is supported by journalists in some parts of the world, but then weaponised against them. And similarly, we see a trend of authoritarian states in particular trying to jump on bandwagons internationally that are respectable and trying to weaponise those networks. So say, for example, anti-corruption, rightly a big drive internationally to ensure that we've better networks and better systems for tackling corruption. But look at the states who sign up to that and who stand on platforms with states who are apparently friends of press freedom, and then they use those anti-corruption laws to target journalists. So that's something that we're seeing. Next point I wanted to make is just some brief points about how difficult it is to defend yourself as a journalist from this kind of attack. Many journalists in the room or online may well have developed over the years good networks of support from media lawyers, for example. You may know defamation lawyers because you have to go to them regularly, for example. Much harder if you're facing a copyright challenge, or if you're facing, for example, a fraud or a regulatory matter, where you may need to access a whole new network, and often a network that doesn't necessarily have a culture of pro bono or low bono support. So you need a much wider range of expertise. You can't necessarily rely on your existing support network, so that's particularly difficult. And then the fact that you're often having to fight multiple battles at the same time. Maria explained it really powerfully when she was talking about just how much of her time is taken up with this, because really what we see here is an attempt to drain your coffers, to drain your resources, to drain your time. And ultimately what that does is it makes it far less likely that you can actually do your job. So if you're spending all your time having to fight multiple lawsuits, or having to defend yourself in the criminal courts, for example, or worry about whether you're going to be arrested or face extradition if you travel to a particular country to do your reporting because of international lawfare targeting you, it's much, much more difficult to just do your day job, get on with doing your actual journalism. So that in itself is really problematic. And then final thing, before handing over to Jodie, that I just wanted to turn to briefly, is what we can do. And I wanted to break that into two broad headings. And this is just some initial thoughts. Firstly, defence. But secondly, and very importantly, counter-attack. Because often I find with lawfare what journalists are doing and what we as the lawyers or activists are doing is we're essentially firefighting. We're dealing with the threat when it comes in and working out how to address it. I think we also have got to start being much more creative and think about counter-attack. Just going back to those concepts that I mentioned earlier, attrition warfare, decapitation and asymmetric costs. These are all concepts we should start turning on the enemies of press freedom. Attrition warfare, strategy of wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse through continuous loss of personnel and material. I mean, these are also strategies which we can use ourselves. We can also start attacking the states that behave in this way, the companies that behave in this way, and the voices of power, the individuals who behave in this way. We can start doing that too. We can also start thinking about strategic paralysis by targeting political leadership. So when you're dealing with states in particular who are cracking down on press freedom, so when you're dealing with Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, China, we need to start thinking about ways in which we can cut that kind of behaviour off at its head. And then ultimately, asymmetric costs, ensuring that the enemy losses is at least an order of magnitude higher than the cost of attacking. Bottom line is, that's how you win these cases, because it's the hassle factor. How is it less hassle for the person who's targeting the journalist? How is it, you need to make sure that it's more hassle for them to attack you than it is for them to leave you alone. In terms of defence, we've got to be ready. We've got to have wider networks, given these new legal threats. We've got to have resources. We've got to have solidarity and support. And also importantly, particularly in a room full of journalists, we do often need to highlight these cases and shout from the rooftops about them. I want to give one example of that that's very important, because it's an example of turning the strategic objective of the person who's trying to silence the journalist against them. So Jonathan didn't, of course, get an introduction, but amongst Jonathan's many very impressive press freedom cases was acting for Paul Radu from OCC or P in the case about the Azerbaijani laundromat a number of years ago, where an Azerbaijani MP, Feziev, had decided to weaponize the law in the UK to go after a Romanian international journalist who was reporting on money laundering in the Azerbaijani laundromat. And that was an obvious slap, and it was an attempt to silence a journalist who'd much lower resources. But really what Jonathan and his team did with Paul, with OCCRP, was see the whites of his eyes. And it ended up that the case was withdrawn days before it was due to go to full trial. And the reason for that was, large part of this was a slap to protect the reputation of the MP. And what they didn't want was sunshine. They didn't want sunlight, and sunlight is the best disinfectant often in these cases. They didn't want attention. And in fact, bringing it to trial and saying, we're ready, we're here to fight, we're ready to go, in fact meant they crawled away and the case fell away. And often speaking about these things and highlighting this kind of conduct is so important. In terms of counter-attack as well, it's very important to me that we give some thought to going after the bag carriers. So going after the people who are the facilitators here. Often the people who are the facilitators here, I'm afraid to say, are the lawyers. So lawyers who will take instructions and will act in cases which are morally dubious and which are not acceptable. Now, we already have in other contexts examples of regulatory provisions which prevent lawyers acting in a way which is immoral or unacceptable. So, for example, with NDAs, the use of non-disclosure agreements, there have been, over a number of years, many women in the Me Too movement who spoke out, wished to speak out, but had a non-disclosure agreement preventing them from speaking out, but also preventing them even from, for example, getting psychological or psychiatric support or speaking to their networks. And one positive example from the UK is that actually the Law Society in the UK gave guidance and a regulatory note making clear that lawyers who are party to those kind of agreements were behaving in breach of their own ethical principles. And very recently, just before Christmas, the Law Society in England and Wales also brought out a note about slaps and about how journalists being targeted through slaps which had no proper legal basis, lawyers who are party to that kind of correspondence, just designed to shut the journalist up without any proper legal basis, could similarly be behaving in a way which was professional misconduct. Now, it seems to me that that's something we should think about. We should also think about when companies are being targeted and when you have international firms who are auditors, for example, who are the bag carriers there, we need to hold them to account. It's not only holding states to account and individuals to account who are the main oppressors, also the bag carriers. Bottom line here is, the enemies of press freedom are creative. We have got to get creative too. We've got to get creative in the way that we defend, and we've also got to get creative in a proactive strategy about how we counterattack and stop this horrendous phenomenon happening. Thank you.
Jodie.
I'm the optimism player, apparently. Well, it's very easy to be optimistic because the way that we are going to tackle this phenomenon is here in this room. It's the Caoilhionns, it's the Matthews, it's the Marias, it's the very many people I know who are engaged day in, day out, and I can see in this room countering this. We have some of the resources, and what we need to do now is amplify. And if we take the warfare examples that Caoilhionn just gave, attrition, decapitation, asymmetric warfare, I might reframe that in a journalistic way and say long, complex, expensive. And the ways in which we are going to tackle these attacks, these legal attacks on journalists, is trying to shorten, to make less complicated, and to make either less expensive or more expensive for the perpetrators. So I want very quickly to give 8 suggestions for how we at the Committee to Protect Journalists see ourselves as able to be tackling this. And the first is we really need to think about skill set expansion, and Caoilhionn already referred to this. It is no longer the case that enemies of press freedom are going after journalists with the usual means, defamation cases. We're sort of used to dealing with those. Being sued for libel is what many news organizations have in-house lawyers specifically for. That's familiar. That's a familiar route. And then in recent years, we saw governments become wise to that, for example, and then they started to use national security laws, for example, accusations of terrorism, accusations of being anti-state, accusations of espionage, as we see in the case most recently of Evan Gershkovich. So we've become a little bit familiar to that. And then authorities started to use new tactics beyond the skill sets and the expertise of media lawyers, so moving into financial accusations, so money laundering, tax evasion. That's more complicated. That requires an expertise that is not naturally sitting within the expertise of the media lawyer with whom journalists are most familiar. So we have to get good at skill set expansion and making sure that we are providing access to journalists to that kind of expertise. We have to think about using this kind of self-regulation, the ethical groupings, the law societies and others, to make sure that lawyers and others are regulating themselves, and similarly auditors and so on. We have, thirdly, to make sure that we are continuing to push for laws that make it difficult for perpetrators to abuse legislation. That's why the work of the slaps and case in Europe is so important. We have to keep pushing where we can for legislation that makes it difficult for perpetrators to use and misuse the law, and to keep pushing for that. And keep pushing also to tackle impunity. As we've already heard, part of the challenge that we have is so often these attacks go unchallenged, including, frankly, the killing of journalists, the most egregious form of censorship that you can imagine. So finding ways in which we can continue to hold people to account long after the incident. I mean, we've got cases where 30 years after the killing of a journalist, we're now starting to see justice. We have to keep pushing on those cases, and there's some really interesting initiatives, including spearheaded by the likes of organizations like FPU in consort with CPJ, to start to do that and build investigative teams that can make sure that people are held to account. The fourth thing we need to do is, as we've heard, target the actors, think of going after the businesses, the organizations that are behind this, the law firms, making sure that they're targeted in a variety of ways, including, frankly, through increased targeted sanctions. That's really important and can be very effective. And then, importantly, we have to, and I'm going to be the person to say it, and you'll hear it a lot this week, funding. It is expensive. You cannot expect people, you cannot expect journalists, journalist organizations, and frankly lawyers to do this stuff for free. You know, people like Jonathan and Caoilfhionn, I know, are very happy to work pro bono in very many circumstances. Local lawyers, who are the people who we need to defend journalists in country, cannot do that and cannot be expected to do that. We need to be able to fund the legal defense. We are up against individuals and groups that have huge pockets, and we need to pay people properly for a proper defense. And that means also supporting local networks. It's really important. It's absolutely vital to have international expertise, but local lawyers are the people who are going to do the bulk of the work and need to be supported. Networks. It's really important, and we've heard it from Matthew. Networks of journalists acting together is a strong defense. We have established with Thomson Reuters Foundation and others the LNGR, the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk, that is intended to help share information about who needs legal support and hopefully direct it to the right place. And there's other initiatives like the Journalist Shield from OCCRP that is also providing that network of defense. The network of defense is really key. And finally, and I know we're rushed for time, so I hope you will all come at 5 o'clock to another session on this question, but please don't be fooled. This is an asymmetric war. The intention of using these kinds of legal arguments to say Maria is involved in dodgy tax practices as a criminal is very deliberate. It's deliberate. It's to throw sand in your eyes and to start this equivalence that suggests journalist equals criminal. And we as journalists and as the community should not be repeating those accusations. So we need to be very vocal in our defense of journalists and of journalism to push back against this repeated smear that journalists are criminals. And so we can't be parroting the same phrases that those who want to silence journalists are using, and I think that's really vital as we go into this battle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jodie. Now, we unfortunately don't have time to take questions or for me to ask a number of the questions that have come into my head during this morning. So I just need to thank the panel on your behalf, on my behalf. Thank you very much. And I know that in 10 minutes' time, another group of people will be sitting up here And that, I think, includes Paul Radu, my former client that Keelan has just mentioned. And if any of you want to stick around, there he is. Hello, Paul. It promises to be extremely interesting. And one of the ways we can fight back is to fight corruption, to cut off the means of supplies, to cut off the money that goes to fund these lawsuits. It all comes through the corrupt practices of the people that sue us. And we should listen to Paul about how to fight that. So thank you very much, and thanks for coming.